It was the end of November, early winter in Dakarma. The sound of the morning bells rang from the central square as per usual. A flock of gray pigeons took flight in a flutter of wings, like a cloud of dust sweeping skyward. It was a gloomy, cold and dreary day. The perfect kind of day to rob a house or send off the dead. All in all, the weather was an appropriate reflection of Joseph's current mood. A few short months ago, he had held the title of first-class lawyer, and had also been the dean of the interstellar Mays University's law school. Dressed immaculately from head to toe, he had been attending a garden party hosted for the elites. But in the blink of an eye, he had become virtually penniless. It was around 8 o'clock in the morning and he was strolling through the bustling black market of Dakarma's West End. He sipped slowly at his coffee while his gaze swept across the many signs in front of the shops lining the street. His skin was beautiful and fair, but his expression was one of immense distaste. It was almost as if the drink he was sipping was not coffee, but unfiltered cat shit. He had been there for half the day in search of an appropriate shop. A shop that could look into a few things for him, and hopefully forge a document or two. 5 minutes later, Joseph came to a stop in front of a store with a small narrow door. The digital sign outside the shop displayed 2 lines. BlackRock Repair Shop, we do everything. Fantastic. Joseph crumpled up the coffee cup, tossed it into the electronic recycling bin on the side of the road, then stepped inside the shop. Good morning. The shopkeeper, whose unruly hair was practically a bird's nest, poked his head out from behind the counter. Is there anything I can help you with? The heater in the shop was on full blast, and even Joseph, who was a bit wary of the cold, could feel its warmth. He peeled off his black gloves and from his coat pocket, he pulled out a metal ring and set it on the counter. Please look into this for me. It was a flexible smart device that could take any shape. Most people preferred a ring-shaped design that was easy to carry with them. Bracelets, rings, earrings, even anklets and waistbands. Joseph's tastes were not quite so obscure, so the object in his hand was merely a plain, unadorned ring. What is it that you want to check? Everything that can be checked. Alrighty. The shopkeeper set up his equipment, and after giving the device a few taps, a hologram was projected. There was a pitiful amount of information displayed on the hologram. In fact, it was so clean that it might as well have come straight from the manufacturer. There were only 4 items in total: 1 identification card, 1 asset card, 1 shuttle ticket to a neighboring planet, and 1 electronically constructed audio file. The shopkeeper, as a matter of principle, wouldn't casually rifle through the contents without permission. However, Joseph had no such qualms and knew the contents of these 4 items inside out. After all, he had already flipped through them a few dozen times over the past 2 days. The identity card was a temporary fake ID. The name on the ID was Ryan, a recent university graduate, who, like any typical new grad, probably didn't know shit. The asset card was from the black market. It was unregistered and probably fake, and the balance on the card wasn't enough for him to live on for more than a month or 2. The shuttle ticket was a one-way ticket with no return flight. It was basically telling him to get the hell out of here and run as far away as he possibly could. Is this everything? The shopkeeper asked. In his mind, Joseph let out a grim laugh. Yes, that's everything. By everything, he didn't mean just the contents of the smart device. He meant everything, as in, this was literally all the worldly belongings he had to his name. Living life on the edge, as they say. And all he had done to deserve this was attend a garden party at the end of May. The wine being served that day had been rather weak, and he had an upset stomach after only half a round of drinks. He had made his excuses to the other guests and had left first. Eventually, he had found a hotel where he could sleep it off. Little did he know, this sleep would last 6 whole months. He had slept from summer until winter, and when he opened his eyes, it was already November. That was 2 days ago. He woke up inside an apartment in the black market, the smart device in question placed beside his pillow. Aside from the smart device, he didn't even have 2 sticks to rub together. Thankfully, there was all sorts of news available online, and it didn't take much effort to piece together the whole story. On the day of the party, there happened to be an explosion at the hotel he was staying at. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and had ended up as one of the unfortunate souls that perished in the accident. However, he was an unfortunate soul that was relatively well known while he was alive. As a result, all the major news sites had posted embellished headlines on the front page expressing shock and regret that he had passed at the height of his prime. They had dragged it on for 2 months, almost as if it was a dog they were taking out on a long stroll, before their coverage slowly trickled off, and he was eventually forgotten. The truth, however, wasn't so simple. The electronic audio file on the smart device had given him a partial explanation. The truth was, someone had saved him from the explosion, and had spent the past 6 months performing a short-term gene modification operation on him. The operation had fine-tuned his appearance and physiological age, and allowed him to temporarily maintain the appearance of a new graduate. A fake ID had been prepared for him, as well as money and a shuttle ticket so that he could fly far away from Karma. In short, everything seemed to point towards the fact that the explosion had been a premeditated vendetta. He wasn't just some poor unfortunate soul caught in the mix, he was the primary target. However, it would be too much to ask a first-rate shyster like Joseph to give a list of people that he could have wronged. There were simply too many to count. Even the devil himself wouldn't be able to keep track. And so, Joseph's only choice was to find someone from the black market to look into the matter. Even if they couldn't figure out the main culprit, it would be enough if they could at least find out the name of his saviour. Half an hour later, the shopkeeper raised his head and rubbed his eyes. His search had come up empty-handed. Joseph frowned. There's nothing on it that's traceable. No, it's clean as a whistle. What about the smart device itself? It's an anonymous model from the black market, so it's too hard to trace. The radices cover so many galaxies, it'd be like finding a needle in a haystack that's the size of the universe. Joseph fiddled with the ring-shaped smart device and eventually said, "All right, how about this? Can you help me resell the shuttle ticket?" The shopkeeper shot a glance at the ticket, then shook his head. "I can't help you. I thought you did everything." Joseph nodded towards the sign outside the door. "It's just an exaggeration." Joseph didn't argue and merely nodded his head a little. "I have one final request." "What is it? Tell me," the shopkeeper said politely. "I've got to solve at least one of your problems today. Otherwise, I may as well toss that sign away." "I need a proof of registration document," Joseph said. "To Mays University's law school, specifically to Southcross Law Firm." Mays University's law school was Karma's oldest and most renowned law school. In fact, it was probably the oldest and most renowned law school in the Jade system. It had ties to all the top law firms in the region, and as long as a student had proof of registration at the school, they could choose any firm to complete an internship at. Of course, whether or not the student would be accepted full-time at a firm was still dependent on their performance. Joseph, however, didn't care if anyone gave him a full-time offer. He just had to get his foot in the door at the Southcross Law Firm. The reason was because Southcross was the firm in charge of the case involving the explosion that supposedly cut him off at his prime. A registration document? The shopkeeper's head swelled just hearing the words. He replied sincerely, "I honestly can't help you with that." "Looks like you were lying when you said you couldn't help me with that shuttle ticket then. Is this really the black market?" Fine. I'll resell the ticket for you," the shopkeeper muttered, throwing up his hands. "The point is that I don't earn much of a margin from it, plus it's annoying and it's easy to get caught." Hair still thoroughly mussed, the shopkeeper continued grumbling for 20 more minutes. Joseph acted as if he hadn't heard him, and waited calmly as if he had all the time in the world. "All right, it's done. You want to transfer the money for the shuttle ticket onto your asset card?" Joseph nodded. "While you're at it, why don't you sort out the registration too?" The shopkeeper's face crumpled. "The registration can't be done, my friend. I'm not joking this time." "Why not? Registration documents aren't particularly complex by nature. Rest assured. I'm only using it for a short while, so it won't be traced back to you. Joseph was completely unbothered about forging something from his own university. The shopkeeper, however, was very bothered. Forging the registration itself doesn't take much skill. I can get it done for you in 2 minutes. But the signature is beyond me. You have to understand, the technology they use to verify signatures nowadays is incredible. Joseph raised a brow. What signature? Each school's proof of registration has the dean's signature, which has an official record, and they're always strict about those things. I'm telling you, it can't be done. Joseph, who had been in a foul mood for the past 2 days, finally let out a laugh. It's not a problem at all. The shopkeeper was 80% certain that this student had gone crazy. 5 minutes later, the shopkeeper realized the person who had gone crazy wasn't the student, it was him. The reason being, he had watched with his own 2 eyes as the student signed the dean's name on the fake registration with a careless flourish. And when the signature was uploaded to the automatic verification system, it was actually approved. It was only after the student had swaggered off with his newly forged registration that the shopkeeper finally recovered his senses. He wanted to smack himself on the head for his slow reaction, and thought dejectedly, "God damn it, I forgot to ask if that kid wanted a job." 5 days later, Joseph found himself sitting inside the most prestigious law firm in Karma. The sofa in the waiting area was warm and cozy, and yet the interns who had come to report for duty were all sitting rigidly. Joseph was the only one who was sitting with his legs crossed and his chin on his hands as he played with the ring-shaped smart device in his hand. He was lost in thought, his posture graceful and relaxed. He didn't look at all like a student who was waiting to be interviewed. He looked more like he was here to interview the students. The blonde kid sitting beside him kept stealing glances at him here and there. Within 10 short minutes, he had glanced over at least a dozen times. "Hey buddy, do I look like an exam screen or something?" Joseph said suddenly, lifting his eyes. The mouthful of coffee that the blonde kid had just drank immediately shot back out. Flustered, he scrambled for a few napkins and wiped at his coffee-stained chin as he replied. "Huh, of course not," he answered, embarrassed. "Then why did you shiver every time you glanced over, like you stepped on an electrical cord?" Whenever Joseph was being sarcastic, he wore a faint smile on his lips. His features gave the impression that he was cold and aloof, so whenever he broke into a smile, it was as if all the iciness in his expression had melted away. It was the kind of smile that could fool anyone, and even the very people he was mocking somehow convinced themselves that it was just his way of expressing friendliness. This blonde kid was no exception. Not only was he oblivious to the fact that he was being ridiculed, he actually felt that he was the one at fault for staring so rudely. "I'm sorry. It's just that you look a bit like our dean." He halted for a bit after he spoke, then corrected himself. "Our previous dean, I mean. You know who I'm talking about, right? The really young and really famous Professor Yan. You don't look exactly like him, of course, since you're a lot younger. It's only at certain angles, and it's sort of the way you sit too. Anyway, it just reminded me of our annual research conference, so I couldn't help but get nervous." As the blonde kid spoke about the previous dean, an expression of pity crossed his face. He let out a sigh and said, he was supposed to attend the research conference this year, and the graduation ceremony too. The accident was so unexpected, and he was so young when he passed away. It's a real shame, isn't it? He had been trying to find some common ground, but when he raised his head, he was met with Joseph's offended expression. While Joseph was still caught up in his weird, complicated feelings about being mourned by someone right in front of him, the human resources manager in charge of the interns arrived. After checking over their registration documents, she guided the interns upstairs. "We've already accepted 3 rounds of interns, so there aren't many lawyers left who have the capacity to take on an intern. I'll introduce you first, and once they have a better understanding, we'll let you know who your assigned lawyer is." On their way up, the HR manager also gave them some background about the firm and a few key points to remember. However, Joseph didn't pay any attention to the latter half of her speech. He had seen a familiar face. When they were halfway up the stairs, a few lawyers just so happened to be making their way down the same flight of stairs. The lawyer at the back of the group was very tall, with extremely handsome features. He was holding a cup of coffee in one hand while the other hand was pressed against his white wireless earpiece. He seemed to be in the middle of a call with someone. The lawyer glanced down at the group of his interns from the corner of his eye, his gaze calm and indifferent as it swept past them. The aura he gave off was one that was cold and unapproachable. The young lawyer's name was Garrett, and he was an old student of Joseph's. Running into an old student was no surprise in this particular field, especially at such a prestigious law firm, where half the lawyers had probably graduated from Mays University. However, there were thousands of new students each year, and the esteemed Professor Yen basically forgot their faces as soon as he saw them. He seldom interacted with them, and the ones he remembered could be counted on one hand. Garrett, however, was one of the few students he could count on that one hand. Why? The first reason was because, technically speaking, Garrett was once a student under his direct charge. The second reason was because this particular student constantly wore a cool expression around him, and always seemed to have a bone to pick with him. At the beginning, their student-teacher relationship hadn't been all that bad. Mays University had a tradition where, 3 months after their start date, new students were asked to select a professor as their direct mentor. This meant that students who had just started adapting to their new surroundings and new classes were forced to quickly settle in and plan out a clear path for their future. It was a wonderful tradition, on paper perhaps. The actual execution, however, was a bit of a joke. Every year when it came time for students to make their selection, the senior students would gather in the school's electronics marketplace. With beaming faces, they would peddle their AI inventions and meds claiming to cure selection anxiety, and even specialty lottery tickets to snag certain professors. The services offered were comprehensive, and the whole process had become a well-oiled machine. Although the process may be absurd, the end result was still more or less the same. The majority of students still ended up choosing the professor who gave them a good impression. Based on Garrett's personality, Joseph knew Garrett hadn't selected him through some lottery. Garrett must have followed the proper selection procedures, which meant that he had made a genuine attempt to walk the mountainous path of his revered master's teachings. However, someone must have fed student Garrett rat poison along the way, and it was why he had leapt off the mountain without so much as a word. In those rare moments when Joseph's conscience would emerge, he would ponder over this particular problem. Unfortunately, he was never able to think on it for more than a few minutes before being interrupted by work matters. It was to the extent that, for a long time, he wasn't able to figure out why this student Garrett was so opposed to him. Eventually, Garrett had graduated, and there was no need for Joseph to ponder anymore. Going up and down the stairs took less than half a minute, but the esteemed Professor Yen still managed to zone out within that time. When he recovered his senses, Garrett had already stepped aside to let the group of interns pass. Garrett was his old student after all, and Joseph couldn't help but feel a bit rueful that under the current circumstances, there was so little fanfare to their reunion. When he was about to turn a corner on the second floor, Joseph turned back and cast another glance downstairs. At that exact moment, Garrett, who had reached the bottom step, removed his wireless earpiece and looked up in his direction. Joseph froze. However, it was only a fleeting glance. Garrett's gaze didn't linger, and he coolly withdrew it without a single shift in his expression or a change in his gait. He was already pushing open a door downstairs without a backward glance. This was a completely normal reaction from a typical stranger, and Joseph merely raised a brow, scratched the back of his head, and turned on his heels. He strolled casually to the tail end of the intern group and entered the conference room on the second floor. "The rooms we passed by just now are our lawyers' offices," said Miss Fizz, the human resources manager. "More often than not, you wouldn't be able to catch even a glimpse of them in there, so today's your lucky day. You had a chance to greet a few of them on the stairs as well, though it seems some of you might have been otherwise preoccupied." The otherwise preoccupied Joseph responded with a small smile and raised his hand. "So sorry about that, I was probably too nervous." His words could only be classified as pure and utter nonsense. Anyone with eyes could see that he wasn't fucking nervous at all. Fizz waved a hand with a smile. Not to worry. Young gentlemen who are a sight for sore eyes can always make my terrible temper go away. Perhaps it was because Miss Fizz seemed approachable, but two of the girls in the group struck up the courage to ask, "Are the lawyers downstairs accepting interns, all of them?" Fizz's expression was one that said, "I've been there too," and she replied, "I wish I could answer yes, all of them, but unfortunately, there's one particular lawyer who's the exception." "Which one?" Miss Fizz smiled. "I'm afraid that if I give you the answer, your faces will be full of woe." My face was more full of woe than anyone else's when I first found out. "Oh, all right then," the two girls said slowly. They had evidently caught on, probably because of some sort of mutual understanding between fellow admirers of aesthetics. One could only guess if the other boys had figured it out for themselves, but the blonde kid who looked as if he had stepped on an electrical cord sure didn't. He just stared blankly at them as they chatted. The esteemed Professor Yan glanced at the blonde kid with a critical eye, and gave him the same kind of silent assessment he had once used to sift through students and pick out the truly gifted. In Joseph's opinion, the kid had all but reached the end of the road of his career. His lack of ability to grasp hidden meanings and read between the lines was worrying, and if he were ever to go to court, the opposition would probably reduce him to a puddle of tears. The two girls may be disappointed, but Joseph was clapping his hands together in glee on the inside. He thanked his lucky stars that the zombie-faced student Garrett didn't accept any interns. Otherwise, in the event that disaster struck and he was assigned to Garrett, their roles as student and teacher would be thrown into chaos and become terribly awkward. Why doesn't he take on any interns? One of the more lively girls was still keen on carrying on the conversation. Fizz didn't seem to be tired of the topic either and replied, "He's worried that his temper will drive away any interns. At least that's what he told management." While it's not clear if he was just giving them an excuse, I still think there's a bit of truth to it. Really? Is his temper that bad? That's not it, but... She paused, seemingly incapable of finding the right words. In the end, she simply shrugged and said, "Anyway, don't get your hopes up, ladies." Joseph was standing off to the side, as calm and composed as you please, as he listened to their conversation. Based on his understanding of student Garrett's personality, the reason he didn't accept interns wasn't because he was worried about pissing off the interns. The more likely reason was because management was afraid that the interns would anger him enough to drive him away. The chances of that happening were pretty high. Fizz continued to chat idly with the interns, and after a short while, the lawyers that had been busy with something downstairs finally came back up and pushed open the door to the meeting room. Once they had filed into the room and sat down, Fizz's eyes scanned the room and she said, perplexed, "Where's Moore? He said he could come by the office to meet the interns. Is he not here yet?" "I didn't see him today," said a serious-looking lawyer with gray eyes and gray hair. "You're sure he was free?" "You can all chat first, I'll go get a hold of him," Fizz said, then turned on her stiletto heels and left the room. Though it was simply a chat, in reality it was simply a less formal version of an interview. And while it was meant to be casual, an interview was still an interview, and the topic always came back to past experience, the details of which were attached to an electronic file containing their registration documents. Throughout the process, the esteemed Professor Yan maintained a graceful, relaxed smile and didn't speak as he looked at the other interns. Given that his registration was from the black market, the electronic file was fake as well. And seeing as he was a counterfeit student, he had kept it modest. After all, the more he said, the easier it was to slip up and give himself away. As a result, the sections in his electronic file noting his past experience, as well as his awards and activities section, were all but blank. At first glance, one would think that there was something wrong with the network, and the file hadn't loaded properly. Moreover, his posture was too calm and too relaxed, and he had even shamelessly shifted his seat closer to the other lawyers. Over the course of the 14-minute interview, the interns subconsciously began to treat him as yet another interviewer. Even the lawyers didn't notice that he had infiltrated their group. As they nodded along, engrossed in a particular conversation, there were a few instances where they tossed out "This batch of interns aren't too bad, right?" at Joseph. Professor Yan, ever the bright-eyed, bushy-tailed wolf, had smiled pleasantly as he replied, "Yes, they're not bad at all." And when the lawyers left the conference room, they didn't notice anything wrong at all. Joseph was more than pleased with the results. The fact that he hadn't instinctively turned things around and interviewed the lawyers himself was already a demonstration of great restraint. However, 10 minutes later, he could no longer bring himself to smile. With hurried steps, Fiz rushed back and forth between the lawyers' offices upstairs and management's offices on the lower floor. Her high heels clicked incessantly, and it was obvious that she was caught up in an issue that had cropped up at the last minute. "You really want to do this? Are you sure? Why do I get the feeling that this is a dangerous idea?" Fiz's voice floated through the half-opened door. She spoke quickly, and there was something like schadenfreude in her tone. "I'm sure, I just spoke to him," a low male voice replied. "Did you get wrecked?" The man clicked his tongue. "Stop laughing, we'll just do it this way. Hurry up and go inside, don't leave those students hanging." The students in the conference room glanced at each other nervously, faces filled with confusion. A few moments later, Fiz walked through the door. She cleared her throat and said with a small smile, "All of you did an excellent job and the lawyers were very pleased with what you've shown. However, I have a bit of bad news to share. Lawyer Moore was supposed to take on an intern, but unfortunately he was involved in a shuttle accident. Right now, he's stuck between 2 nearby planets, and it'll be over half a month before he can return. As a result, the intern that was meant to work with him will be paired with another lawyer." Joseph suddenly had a very bad feeling. His sixth sense was selective in its accuracy. The chances of it being correct was about 50-50, and it only worked when the outcome was unclear. One could call it speaking tragedies into existence, or better yet, having a crow's mouth. Fiz continued, "Let me go over your assignments. Miss Phillida, Lawyer Dean is pleased to be working with you in the coming period. Congratulations, Henry. Lawyer Aves will be your teacher." She went down the list of names and eventually turned towards Joseph with a radiant smile. "I've mentioned it already, but I want to apologize again on behalf of Lawyer Moore. However, I'd like to congratulate you as Lawyer Gu will become your teacher going forward. Good luck." Although the words she had uttered were "good luck," her tone made them sound more like "do your best." The esteemed Professor Yan looked as if someone had splashed a bucket of liquid nitrogen in his face. The faint smile on his lips was so frozen it had almost split in half. It took a few seconds for his expression to thaw and he replied, "Thank you. I'll do my best to not piss off your distinguished lawyer and drive him away, but no promises." After all, Joseph had pissed him off plenty of times back in the day. Also, Joseph thought to himself with a smile, "You're better off telling Garrett to do his best. Youngsters should look out for themselves." Half an hour later, Joseph found himself sitting behind the intern's desk that Fiz had found someone to set up. He was face to face with Garrett, who was seated behind his own larger lawyer's desk. Joseph took a silent sip of his coffee. Garrett took a sip of his coffee as well. The atmosphere was truly somber, and for a moment it was hard to tell who was visiting whose grave, and whose cup of coffee seemed like it was filled with cat shit.